Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for the invite to speak here. I was asked to talk about a bird's eye view of carbon, and it's one of the problems we face at the moment is that if a farmer's going looking for advice on carbon and carbon management, the only people you can go to are self-interested carbon salespeople who want to sell you a carbon project. And that's not who you go to. Like, you don't go to someone who's selling insurance to buy, well, I guess you do, but that was a bad analogy. But we have this problem where the people that are giving most of the advice to farmers are actually self-interested. And you can't go to your local extension officer and get the full story. And so we started a course on carbon farming, and it was a lockdown project, and it's gone absolutely ballistic. I think we've put 5,000 people through the course already. And it just shows you the dearth of information that's out there where people are looking for independent advice on how to view this subject called carbon. So I tend to start with who's asking, like where's the pressure coming from? And it's fair to say there was some move in this area prior to the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Climate Change Agreement was the first time that countries all came together and said, we will make a commitment to be net zero by 2050. And then the Glasgow Agreement, the COP26, said, well, 2050 is too far out. We want to know what you're going to do before then. And so we saw the Australian government say we'll be 43% reduced on emissions by 2030. Now, I throw that in the right-hand side there because methane is part of the picture. There's a lot of debate around how it's measured, and if you want to go in the question time, we can. But the science is fairly clear that if methane has to make its contribution, those are the targets that we should be looking for methane to make its relative contribution. Now, so who's actually asking? And I keep revamping this slide because the whole conversation keeps moving. If you looked at that slide 10 years ago, it was all emissions intensity based. After the Paris Agreement, all these companies switched from emissions intensity to absolute emissions, including their scope 3. The scope 3 is their on-farm emissions that they inherit. And so you can see a very strong presence of dairy in that list of targets. Now, before you think they've got it all under control, I get to speak to a lot of these senior managements of various companies, large multinationals, about this, and they say, Richard, can you come and help us? We've set a target, but we have no idea how we're going to get there. And you kind of think, well, maybe you should have thought about that before you tried. But anyway, that's the way it is. And so, but one nuance I've seen come in of late is there's a bit of a subtext come into a lot of these targets where it's not just a target. They've started realizing, actually, we need a partnership with our farmers to get there. And so a number of them now, you can go and read the subtext that says this is only going to be achieved by a partnership between us as Fonterra and their farmers, or Sunrise was the one who had it in the other day. So there's a bit of reality check. This is a shared journey we have to be on here. And I think it's fair to say that the world I was born into has changed, where governments sort of made policy and that drove the agenda. This is not government driving the agenda. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, 69 are companies, not countries. You think of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, bigger than half the economies in Africa now. And because Australia is about 70% export focused generally, not specifically dairy, I think what the supply chain are actually wanting in the future is actually more material to us than domestic policy, sad to say. And when you think this might not matter, this is an example, it's a fairly dated example now, it shows you how long this has been around. Where it's the Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return Report submitted to the London Stock Exchange, designed to list all the publicly listed livestock companies on the risk of investment on their environmental performance. Now, right or wrong, whatever metric they used, I don't know, but it was quite notable that number 4 from the good side is Fonterra, because they put a lot of money into research in this area in New Zealand, and they've been keeping carbon audits on farms in New Zealand. Somewhere in the middle is Ingham's, an Australian company. And about 7th from the right is one of our largest cattle companies in Australia, AACo. Now, you can imagine this comes out, and within a couple of days, I get a phone call from the special operations manager at AACo, help, what do we do? So we jump on a plane and we go through all their properties looking for carbon projects and doing carbon audits. And now they are involved in the herd methodology, they're involved in savanna burning as a methodology. Their website's full of what they're doing on greenhouse gases, and they would rank differently if they had to be re-ranked today. The emissions haven't come down, but The story's there. Now, this next slide can be seen as controversial, but I want you to see it in the counterfactual. I want to imagine you're a dairy farmer reading these words, because I'm not one of those who thinks that, you know, nut milks will take the world. I think they'll remain a niche market, but that's just my unprofessional opinion. But if you look at Danone, for example, one of the largest dairy processors has spent $12.5 billion to buy the nut milks, the Silk brands. Now, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you're a dairy farmer reading those words, leveraging consumer trends, healthier, more sustainable eating and drinking choices. Now, I think it comes back to Tim's point. Tim made a point about the narrative that's out there that we have to do more to talk up what we do as dairy. We all know about Eden Brew and milk from precision fermentation. Again, it may never take the world. It may only ever be a niche product. I see there's this eternal battle between the kind of person who wants to drink a yeast milk versus someone who wants GM in their diet, because there's a bit of a conflict there. But at the same time, the words that are used, there's no methane from animals, there's no pollution. Now, I think Tim raised this, that no one's done a full life cycle assessment and proven that it takes 60,000 litres of water to produce a litre of almond milk. That doesn't get in the narrative. But so we've got to get the narrative out there about the credentials we have as an industry. So I'm not saying these will take the world, but what I am saying is the language that's being used is out there. So we know that the red meat industry has set a very brave target. You know, I don't know if I would advise them to set a carbon neutral target. And there's discussion as to whether did we mean climate neutral or did we mean carbon neutral, but actually they're sticking with carbon neutral because the risk of greenwashing halfway through by softening your target is too great in the media, and so they've said, well, we're sticking, we might not get there, but we're sticking with it. But there's a reason why they do that, because there's other jurisdictions, competitors around the world doing the same thing. We've seen a number of Brazilian states set their targets. Carbon neutral Brazilian beef making a big inroad into the EU. We went and had a look at it and discovered it wasn't vaguely carbon neutral on international accounting standards, but nothing gets in the way of a good marketing story. But at the same time, you know, when it hits the wall and the European consumers find out it's not carbon neutral, then I think the penalty will be worse. So let's be careful what we do. But we've heard from New Zealand. What's interesting in New Zealand is they didn't set a zero target for methane. They used that science that Claudia Arndt published, saying for methane to do its share of the heavy lifting, it probably doesn't have to be zero. So instead of changing how we measure methane, let's say, well, let's accept that it might not need to be zero. So I don't know, Tim might be able to comment on that later. But we see it lining up with the California legislation aiming for 40% less methane, and all lining up with the global methane pledge of 30% less methane. So before we get excited about changing the metric on how we measure methane, I think the conversation's moved. It's beyond that. We're not multiplying that by anything. We're saying the global methane pledge is an absolute reduction of 30% of methane. We're not multiplying it by something to get a warming equivalent. So the argument about changing the metric might be an outdated argument already. And then just to show you, there's just a quick web search will show you some companies that are aiming for carbon neutral meat and others that are aiming for carbon neutral wine. Now, why do I present those two? They're at the opposite ends of the spectrum. The challenge of reducing red meat methane when you don't even know where the cows are walking around the Kimberley is a vastly different challenge to a winery where 95% of the emissions come from diesel and electricity. Only 5% of the emissions in a bottle of wine comes from the actual winery, so plant a few trees and you'll be right. But then when you start digging into this, you see that some of these companies are just buying offsets. Now, the intention of carbon neutral is actually you do everything you can to reduce emissions, and then you use offsets for the intractable balance. So actually, technically, no one's ever been carbon neutral in agriculture, even though we talk about it, because the true definition says you've got to do something first, whereas, you know, you buy a Coles carbon neutral meat. Now, I'd have a lot to do with Coles, and it's maturing the conversation, but they're only offsetting the 200 grams on your plate. They're not offsetting the entire breeder herd that sits behind it. So it's the same as the Brazilian carbon neutral meat brand. So where industry are at now is they're starting to realize codependency, because McDonald's wants to be carbon neutral, Coles wants to be, they share one carcass. So they need to actually share in the carbon neutrality of that carcass. They realize they actually need each other, because by sharing that pain, they could all achieve an outcome. So I think that's where a lot of discussion has to be. But what that's been instructive for us is to show us how it might actually work. And it goes back to Tim's point earlier about emissions intensity. While we've been good at emissions intensity, it doesn't actually help the atmosphere. But if you're Coles and JBS and you want to buy a low emissions product, you can only buy on emissions intensity. That's the only metric you've got. Flawed as it is, because if you bought on absolute emissions, you'd only buy small farms. You wouldn't buy big farms because they produce more emissions than small farms. But that's not the point. So we've seen how Coles have gone around their buying. They've said, well, we'll get a carbon audit done on all our suppliers, and that's that QR code on the right there, where the whole carbon audit has been done, and they come up with a number. And they start buying from the left. Why would they buy from the right? You have to buy 3 times the carbon credits to achieve carbon neutrality if you buy from the right. If you buy from the left, it's cheaper. And we're starting to see that language come out in the international arena as well, where groups like Cargill are saying, how do we buy on the global stage? Well, we buy from countries that are inherently lower emissions, and that's how we get to our target without having to buy carbon credits. Why I mention this is because we can be guilty of disempowering farmers saying you need to be net zero, and yet they've got no tools to get there. But if you look at that and say emissions intensity matters today, how do you get to the front of the queue? How do you become the 8 and not the 25? Well, it's just best practice. It's better calving rates, it's better weaning rates, it's better fertilizer use, it's more judicious with your whole farming system. The only reason why prime lamb gets to lower than beef is because prime lamb is 150% weaning. You just, as I think Tim mentioned, you're playing with the denominator rather than the numerator. So if you've got double the number of lambs coming out the system compared to beef, well, you've doubled the denominator. That's all it is. But it re-empowers farmers to say best practice matters today, and it'll get you at the head of the queue. So I think that's important. The other important conclusion is I was part of the Net Zero Australia plan, which we worked with Princeton University and with the University of Queensland on. And that was tracking the pathway for every industry to get to its net zero and saying what is going to happen there. And I was part of the agriculture part. In fact, I led the agriculture part of that. And so we reconciled the cotton industry, the rice industry, how each industry, on known trajectories of technology and previous performance. What that showed us is that agriculture, if they keep all their soil carbon, if they keep all their tree carbon within the farm, you will still struggle to get to net zero by 2050. So this notion that there are all these surplus carbon credits for agriculture to generate and feed to the fossil fuel industry is actually quite a furphy. The surplus carbon credits don't exist. So, and you'll say, well, individual farms might have surpluses of soil carbon. No, not if you amortize it over drought periods and flood periods. And so what we've done is we've worked with Climate Active, which certifies low carbon status, and said, well, let's get around this by just putting that in as a 10-year running mean into your carbon account. So we get around the climate variability effect of sequestration. But the bottom line is there are no surplus offsets. And we've also were approached by the wheat industry in Western Australia, really concerned about the aggressive buying of agricultural land to plant down to trees by the mining industry. So groups like Woodside Petroleum buying land. Simple calculation. If you take all the mining industry emissions in Western Australia and you convert 4.5 million hectares of wheat into growing eucalypts, you offset 50% of their emissions for 25 years on a decreasing term. So you only get halfway to their emissions. So you need all the cropping land in Western Australia to offset the mining industry. So this idea of simply buying agricultural land and putting it down to trees is also a furphy. And we need to make sure that doesn't happen. So where does this land us? It lands us in a situation where we say, well, maybe between now and 2030, there's an advantage to carbon neutral marketing, same as organic marketing, for example. But it'll go the same way as organic marketing. I think someone mentioned, one of the previous speakers might have said, you know, organic produce in Europe has hit the wall. That'll happen with us and carbon by 2030 when everyone's doing it, because all the supply chains are requiring you to inset your carbon, to keep your carbon. And so we have worked on some case studies where farmers have been able to access premium wool markets for carbon neutrality, you know, in Italy, for example. But that'll start fading by 2030 when we're all doing it, and the language will shift from offsetting to insetting, where it'll be realized by agriculture keeping your carbon in your own system is actually more important to access your supply chain than selling it off for short-term gain. And so we'll see a shift in the language. I'll come back to the biodiversity one in a moment. I think there's also a realization that there's a fundamental difference between different types of carbon. We've treated them the same, given them the same price, but they're fundamentally different in the risk profile. What I mean by that, you think about carbon sequestration. You store carbon in your soil. Your soil has a potential of 4% carbon. So you store it up to 4%, and then you sell that and generate Australian carbon credit units and sell them to a power station. That's gone. You'll never be able to use that as part of your supply chain target again. You'll never be able to use that carbon as your farm carbon balance. You've sold it. But the problem is the carbon's still sitting in your soil. Your soil only has a potential to get to 4%, so you can't double it to 8% now and get more carbon. So you've kind of sold your options. And that's starting to realize. We've also done some correlations with the recent carbon credits issued and discovered that we can explain 70% of the ACCUs issued on soil carbon by rainfall. 70% of the change in soil carbon can be explained by the fact we've come out of a drought and we're now heading into 3 years of La Nina. And guess what? We're heading into a SOR positive and an El Nino, and what's going to happen to the carbon? It's probably just going to barrel back out the soil again. Not all of it, but most of it. As opposed to an emissions reduction. So take the scenario, you've got steers and you sell steers a year earlier. So you're in Northern Australia and you've got steers going to market at 36 months, and now you can get them, you feed them better, they go out at 18 months. That's 18 months of methane they simply didn't produce. There's no need to look after that for the next 20 years. There's no need to prove. Once you've proven it, you can sell it with impunity because it has no bearing on next year's emissions. And the banks are starting to realize the risk profile of investing in something that can either be burned by a bushfire or is subject to variable rainfall. Remember, we live in the most climate variable country in the world, as opposed to something that is risk avoidance and emissions avoidance, which is fundamentally different. So this leads me to where do we go from here? Because I was part of developing this Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, which was trying to reconcile all these ESG frameworks coming at us from around the world into one that we can buy into. And I contributed to the greenhouse gas area of that, but have a look at where the arrows are pointing and tell me what's coming next. Biodiversity is next on the agenda. And I can guarantee you that by 2030, we're insetting our carbon, we're doing carbon, and the next ESG required is biodiversity and water. We know that's coming. Now, why do I mention that? Because we could be guilty of a myopic focus on carbon to the exclusion of accessing biodiversity later, and we've got to be careful about what we do. I'll give you an example. Sorry, Tim, it's New Zealand again. But we're seeing a lot of pine plantations going into New Zealand dairy, sheep pastures, not dairy, sheep. So sheep pastures going to pine because it returns the best per hectare in carbon today. But guess what? When we get to 2030 and everyone wants biodiversity, the world wants biodiversity, well, I think Kiwis go and hide in the pines because that's a safer spot for them. But I'm not sure there's much biodiversity under pine trees. So we've got to keep the long game in mind here. I might go quickly through this section, just emphasizing what are the emissions from various agricultural systems, in that you've got to remember no two systems are the same. So you've got a northern beef system where it's mainly methane because, well, proportionately there's not a lot of fertilizer going on there, well, no fertilizer. But dairy, for example, uses more energy and fertilizer, so it just changes the proportions. Cropping on the right-hand side, well, it's all about nitrogen fertilizers because there is no methane there. Same with pigs and poultry. It doesn't happen from the animal. It all happens in the manure management post the shed. So their options are very different to dairy, which is very different to cattle in the Kimberley, for example. The rice industry, we did that. I spoke at the rice conference the other day, and we produced this diagram on the bottom right. Shows it's mainly methane. But guess what? Rice doesn't have to actually be flooded until it sets seed. So if you don't flood it until it sets seeds, you knock out 2/3 of that methane straight away. Apparently the bittern birds don't like it because they'll lose their habitat. I might just go straight on to this one because this is a question that comes up all the time. So I get asked regularly about, well, we grow grass and that's tons of carbon. So why don't I get given a credit or a recognition for the carbon in the grass? And the Grain Export Council asked me, so why don't we get a credit for all the carbon that goes out of Australia in grains? And I put this together to explain it and say, yes, we get carbon out of photosynthesis. It comes in as CO2 and becomes carbohydrate. So straight away, carbon is not carbon. It goes from being a gas to being a carbohydrate, which is a sugar. So don't think carbon is carbon. So then the animal eats it. and it goes back to the atmosphere as CO2. So most of what the animal produces and belches out is just CO2, but a small amount is methane. Now, when you look at this cycle, what I say to people is, for carbon accounting, what matters is where is the carbon 10 years later. So look at that diagram and try to understand where does the carbon stop in the landscape for decadal time steps, because the rest is completely neutral. The rest just recycles within 12 months. So you might grow 14 tons of pasture, which is 7 tons of carbon. Of that 14 tons, let's assume the cow grazed 75% of it and then belched it out and you ate the meat and milk. And by the time you've eaten the meat and milk, you respire the CO2 back to the atmosphere and it's all back where it came from. The grass that the animal ate was belched out as CO2. It went back to the atmosphere within 12 months. So if you track the carbon, it doesn't stop in the landscape there apart from methane for about 12 years. If it goes into the soil, some of it becomes long-term soil carbon, but think about what the purpose of soil microbes are. The purpose of having big microbe populations in the soil in healthy soils is to churn over the carbons, to use it as food, to turn it over and to release the nitrogen so you can grow more grass, to hold more water in your soil. Those are the benefits that are there. But don't feel like, if the microbes are doing their job, they're turning it over. They can turn over 5 tons of that carbon. So now you're starting to run into problems with the carbon budget, saying, hang on, all the carbon that went into the soil microbial biomass, they chewed it up as their respiration and they sent it back to the atmosphere because that's where it belongs. And they liberated the nutrients. So in the end, what you find is carbon only stops in that budget in the form of methane, and it stops in the form of long-term soil carbon, which it can, or it stops in a tree that might be there in 10 years' time. The rest is just a big input on the budget and a big output on the other side of the same budget, and there's no carbon sequestration involved at all. It's in and out. But that's how it's designed to be. So I would say the day we get to low methane cows is the day that whole cycle becomes positive, and it's no longer a negative cycle. And so that's why the imperative for research is so strong to get there. Now, I might just wrap it up by saying just a few more final thoughts. Our analysis would say the average dairy farm can reduce its emissions by 50% overnight if we had to. Now, big caveat, the big red letters in the bottom right-hand corner. None of this is profitable right now unless there's a driver. Unless there's a policy environment or there's a profitability environment. Let me step through the options. In the rumen, 10 years ago we didn't know we could reduce methane, and then DSM Nutrition comes out with the Bovier product, the Dutch company that we saw the video of earlier. Our research, we're about to release an equation that will credit farmers for feeding the product. If you feed it correctly, you can get 80% less methane if you can get it continually in the rumen, but reality check is about 40%. Problem is it'll cost you 50 cents per cow per day, and the pain point is about 7 cents per cow per day. So if you were to be paid $30 a ton for carbon credits and you got 40% less methane, you can afford to pay 7 cents. But the product is about 50 cents per cow per day. So things have to change. Effluent. We know that we can generate methane out of our effluent. It's just going to cost you $1 million to cover the effluent pond and to put the steam turbine in and generate it. It is possible, but economies of scale are the problem there, where we've seen large piggeries in New South Wales commercialize that model and sell renewable energy into the grid. I mean, that is possible at that scale. But I suspect, dairy farmers might be able to correct me, but I suspect you need at least 1,000 to 1,500 cows to make it even commercially cost neutral in Australia. So energy is the other part. About 10% of a dairy farm's emissions is energy. So we do know we've got electric bikes already, we've got solar, we've got the potential for green energy. There is potential, if the adoption was required, that we could wean ourselves off energy, because there's so much energy that can be generated on a dairy farm. Nitrous oxide. We know we can coat our fertilizers with an inhibitor. That's been in the marketplace for 20, 30 years. It just costs 14% more per unit nitrogen. So we've got a plan in front of the minister at the moment, and I spoke to Minister Watt a few days ago about this plan where we're just going to work with 20 fertilizer companies to pre-coat all the fertilizer in Australia, and that means all the cropping industries will drop their emissions by 50% overnight. Sounds too easy, doesn't it? A lot of policy to go under that one, but that seems to be the most seamless way forward, that government actually buy the nitrous oxide reduction, not subsidize the fertilizer. That's the way the policy will work. We know from work in New Zealand that you can spray dairy pasture to keep all the urine in the ammonium form. That's been shown to reduce nitrous oxide by 90%. Yes, it did hit the policy wall, but it is going to come back on the agenda, I believe. Once it's on the Codex list, it'll come back on. It's a very benign chemical, probably more benign than most of the others we're willing to use already. So that's possible. And then manure, cover the ponds as part of renewable energy generation. So I guess I'm presenting this to say we're actually in a strong position if we had to react. The problem is we don't have a signal. We don't have a clear market signal. We don't have a policy signal to respond. But dairy's actually in a very strong position if it had to respond. Now, I'll finish off with this because this is part of the challenge. Reducing methane is not a small problem. This rumen evolved about 50 million years ago to a steady state of microbial composition and decided that methane was the best way to dispose of CO2 and hydrogen. 30 years ago, we decided this was a problem and we're going to fundamentally alter 50 million years of stable evolution in 3-year funding rounds that we drip feed to researchers. Not looking at Dairy Australia here. It's not a small challenge. So we know, Manensin, for example, great results. Feed Manensin to the cows, you get 10% less methane, but 3 months later they've adapted. The rumen is a dynamic system. Let me show you how dynamic it is. Just 1 milliliter of rumen fluid has 10 to the power of 11 bacterial cells per milliliter. Can you even imagine that? 10 to the power of 11 zeros on the end of that is the number that's just in 1 milliliter of rumen fluid. I do mention this to farmers because the soil is the same. If you look at the soil composition, it's much the same. But we've got people going around selling you 250 mils of microbial mix that you spray on your soil, and it's going to fundamentally alter 10 to the power of 11 stable microbes that have been there for 50 million years. And when you put it like that, you think, why do we even listen to this? So this is just a list of what's available, and a lot of this is just the do now options on the left, saying there are things we can do around herd management, efficiency, getting rid of unproductive cows, not having that house cow, better replacement rates, bringing legumes back into our system. There are a lot of legumes that we're looking at the moment that have potential to reduce methane and probably would reduce our reliance on nitrogen fertilizer. There's supplements in the market, oils, tannins, things like grape marc that have oil and tannin in them. We can breed. We can either breed to say, well, if we like a particular legume like white clover, we can actually turn on the gene in white clover to produce tannin. It's already been done, by the way. I probably shouldn't have said that. But these things are possible now, that we can actually have our cake and eat it, where there are things we can turn on in the grass, we can turn on in the legumes, and don't have to worry about an extensive adoption profile of some new legume that you have to adopt. But we can also breed animals for residual methane production, which is consistent with feed conversion efficiency. The only problem with breeding targets is you get 1% per year, but it's cumulative and permanent. So the reward on an annual time step's not great. We do know the methane vaccine program has been going in New Zealand, and while the target delivery date keeps getting revised outwards, it will achieve about 20%, and the newer version probably more than that. We know about the seaweed Asparagopsis versus Bovia 3-nop. They are the bigger options. Bovia is now registered in most countries for feeding. It is a completely benign product. It's got a clean bill of health. It breaks down to propionate and nitrate in the rumen, so you can't even pick up the breakdown products in the rumen environment. So it's quite different to seaweed, which is quite a toxic compound. But I hold my hopes on early life programming, where there's some early research, as in that graph there, that says in the grey area, they fed Bovia, the DSM nutrition product, to cows and calves through the weaning phase. And then they stopped at the end of the grey period, and the calves remained about 20% less methane for the rest of the measurement period. That only goes out to something like 40 days, I think, but the experiment went out to 100 days. If we can repeat that, then it's not something farmers have to pay for a supplement every day. You can intervene once and let it roll from there, and that's why I think this is more of a solution to more of the extensive grazing industries in the world. So to finish off, I think we need to realize we can't sell carbon credits and claim to be low carbon. You can't do both. You can't sell your carbon credits to the power station. They claim to be low carbon and you do as well. That's double counting. Get independent advice, because insetting, keeping your carbon for yourself, doesn't require you to generate Australian carbon credit units and doesn't require you to spend all the money up front. I met with a farmer the other day that had spent over $1 million generating soil carbon credits that they don't know what to do with now, because they're stuck. They can't sell them, or else they'll never be low carbon again. So be careful. Don't sell soil or tree carbon. You might need it to demonstrate that you're low carbon by 2030. What do you do now? Know your number, get to know what your number is, and then investigate how to shift that number. Because shifting the number in the first place is just better practice on farm. Better nitrogen fertilizer use, better weaning, better replacement rates, getting rid of inefficient animals. So you start with the do now strategies, and that's the basis on what the supply chain will be asking for us. So thank you very much.